Frank turned to me and asked if I wanted to keep going on this trip or fly home early. He said whatever I chose, he and the boys would support me completely. I thought about all the planning Tom and I did for restaurants. I thought about the Japanese phrases I taught Bobby. I thought about how excited I'd been for 3 months. I told Frank I wanted to stay because I wasn't letting Linda's problems ruin something I'd looked forward to for so long. Frank nodded and told Linda she needed to treat me with basic respect for the rest of the trip. He said if she couldn't manage that, she'd be the one going home early instead of me. Linda whispered that she understood. Frank got up and opened the door to call the boys back in. Tom and Bobby came in looking worried and Frank sat them down. He explained that we'd talked through some issues and we were finishing the vacation as a family. Tom asked if everything was okay, and Frank said it would be. Bobby looked at Linda's red eyes and then at me. He came over and hugged me tight without saying anything. That evening we went to a restaurant near the hotel. Linda sat across from me and barely spoke during the whole meal. She ordered food and ate it but kept her eyes on her plate. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut. Tom tried making jokes about the robot restaurant and how wild the show had been. He did impressions of the robots and got Bobby laughing. Bobby pulled out his phone and showed us pictures from the temple. He had shots of the gardens and the statues and one really good one of the main building. Frank looked at each picture and asked Bobby questions about what he'd learned. Linda just nodded when anyone spoke to her directly. The waiter brought our food and I focused on eating. The sushi was amazing, but I couldn't really enjoy it with Linda sitting there looking miserable. Tom kept the conversation going by talking about what we should do tomorrow. He mentioned the Japanese garden we'd planned to visit. Bobby said he wanted to see the koi fish there. Frank agreed and said we'd go first thing in the morning. The next day we took a taxi to the garden. Linda sat in the front seat and didn't say much during the drive. When we got there, she walked next to me instead of trailing behind like usual. She pointed at a map near the entrance and asked if I wanted to see the tea house first. Her voice sounded stiff like she was reading from a script. I said sure, and we all headed that direction. The garden was beautiful with perfectly trimmed trees and stone paths winding between ponds. Bobby ran ahead to look at the koi fish. Tom took pictures of everything. Linda stayed close and made comments about the plants we passed. She asked me what I thought about the bridge over the main pond. I said it was pretty, and she agreed. Everything felt forced and awkward. She was including me because Frank told her to, and not because she actually wanted me there. At the tea house, we sat on the floor, and a woman in a kimono served us tea. Linda sat between me and Bobby. She asked me if I'd tried green tea before. I said yes at home, and she nodded. The conversation died, and we drank our tea in silence. Tom made a face at the bitter taste, and Bobby laughed at him. Frank smiled, and the tension broke a little bit. We walked through the rest of the garden, and Linda kept making an effort. She'd point things out to me or ask my opinion about which path to take. It all felt like an act, but at least she wasn't pretending I didn't exist anymore. For lunch, Tom and I had picked out a sushi place we'd been excited about. We'd spent hours looking at the menu online and planning what to order. When we sat down, Linda looked at her menu and then at me. She asked what I recommended since I'd studied everything beforehand. I was surprised she remembered that. I suggested the salmon set and the tuna rolls. I told her about the special sauce they made and how good the reviews said it was. Linda ordered exactly what I suggested. When the food came, she tried everything and then looked at me. She said the salmon was really good and thanked me for the recommendation. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge after everything. Tom grinned at me across the table. Bobby asked me to help him order dessert. Frank watched Linda and me with this careful expression like he was making sure she kept her word. The rest of lunch was easier. Linda didn't talk much, but when she did speak, she was included me naturally. She asked about my favorite parts of the trip so far. She listened when I answered. It still felt like she was following rules Frank set instead of genuinely caring, but it was better than her trying to erase me from the family. That evening, Bobby brought up the anime store he'd found online. He showed us pictures of the merchandise on his phone and looked at Linda like he expected her to say no. She glanced at the photos and then at Frank before nodding and saying we could go tomorrow morning. Bobby's face lit up and he started talking about all the things he wanted to look at. Tom said he'd been wanting to check out Japanese manga stores too. I was surprised Linda agreed without making excuses or suggesting the boys go without me. The next morning, we took the train to Akihabara and found the store Bobby had researched. It was huge with multiple floors of anime figures, manga, and merchandise I'd never seen before. Bobby ran ahead, pulling Tom with him, and I followed close behind. Linda walked in last and stood near the entrance watching us. We spent almost 2 hours looking at everything. Bobby found figures from his favorite shows and kept showing them to me, asking if I thought they were cool. Tom discovered a whole section of manga he couldn't get back home and started making a list of what to buy. I found some Studio Ghibli merchandise, and Linda actually walked over to look at what I was holding. She asked if I liked those movies, and I said they were my favorite. She picked up a small Totoro keychain and looked at it for a minute before putting it back down. She didn't complain once about how long we were taking or try to rush us out. She just stood there quiet and patient while the three of us got excited over everything we found. When we finally left the store, Bobby was carrying 2 full bags and thanking everyone for letting him take so much time there. Our last full day in Japan, we drove to Mount Fuji. The weather was perfect and the mountain looked amazing against the blue sky. Frank wanted to take a family photo with the mountain behind us. He asked another tourist to take the picture and we all lined up. Linda stood on one side of me instead of positioning herself at the opposite end like she usually did. Tom was on my other side and Bobby stood in front of us. Frank stood next to Linda and put his arm around her shoulder. The tourist counted to 3 and took several shots. Linda's smile looked forced and uncomfortable, but at least she was trying to look like she wanted to be there. Frank thanked the tourist and we looked at the photos together. In every picture, Linda was standing right next to me, making it look like we were actually a family unit instead of 4 people plus 1 outsider. Bobby said we should print the photo and frame it when we got home. Linda didn't object or suggest taking another one without me. We walked around the visitor center and looked at the exhibits about the mountain's history. Linda stayed with the group the whole time and even made a few comments about what we were seeing. It still felt awkward and forced, like she was following Frank's rules instead of genuinely wanting to include me, but it was better than her actively trying to erase me from everything. The flight home the next day was long but less tense than I expected. Linda took a window seat and put in earbuds almost immediately. She closed her eyes and seemed to fall asleep within the first hour. Tom and Bobby sat in the row with me and we picked out movies to watch together. Bobby wanted to watch something funny, and Tom found an action movie we all agreed on. Frank sat next to Linda but kept leaning into the aisle to check on us. He'd ask if we needed anything or if we were comfortable. I could tell he was watching to make sure Linda didn't try anything else now that we were heading back to reality. She slept through most of the flight, and when she was awake, she just stared out the window or scrolled through her phone. She didn't try to talk to any of us or make comments about the trip. The boys and I talked quietly about our favorite parts of Japan and what we wanted to do when we got home. Tom said he wanted to learn more Japanese and maybe take a class at the school. Bobby said he wanted to go back someday and see more cities. I agreed and said I'd love to visit Osaka next time. Linda turned her head slightly when I said that, like she was listening, but she didn't say anything. When we got home and unpacked, Frank told Linda to sit down in the living room because they needed to talk. He pulled out his phone and started looking up family therapists in our area. Linda watched him with this unhappy expression, but she didn't argue or make excuses. Frank found someone named Catherine Flynn, who had good reviews and specialized in blended family issues. He called and made an appointment for the following week. Linda said she didn't think therapy was necessary and they could work things out themselves. Frank looked at her and said this wasn't optional if she wanted their marriage to continue. His voice was calm but firm, and Linda's face went pale. She nodded and said she'd go. Frank scheduled the appointment for all 5 of us and wrote it on the calendar in the kitchen. Tom and Bobby came downstairs and asked what was happening. Frank explained we'd be going to family therapy to work through some issues. Tom looked at Linda and said it was about time someone made her face what she'd been doing. Linda opened her mouth like she wanted to respond, but closed it again and looked down at her hands. The first therapy session was in a small office with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Catherine Flynn was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She asked us each to introduce ourselves and then said she wanted to hear from everyone about their experience of the blended family. Linda went first and started talking about how hard it was to blend 2 families together. She said she'd felt excluded from Frank and the boys' relationship, and like she was always on the outside looking in. She talked about how I seemed to fit in so easily while she struggled to find her place. Tom interrupted her mid-sentence and said that wasn't true at all. He listed specific examples of how Linda had actively excluded me from family activities. He brought up the times she'd said I was grounded when I wasn't, and the times she'd claimed I was sick when the boys wanted me to come along. Bobby added that Linda had tried to keep me from coming to Japan with multiple lies. Frank backed them up and told Catherine about the fake grandmother story and the wrong terminal number. Linda's face turned red and she tried to defend herself, but Catherine held up her hand and asked her to listen to what her family was saying. Catherine looked at Linda and said that from what she was hearing, Linda's jealousy stemmed from her own feelings about herself, rather than anything I actually did. She asked Linda to think about why she felt threatened by a teenage girl, instead of embracing her as part of the family. Linda was quiet for a long time before answering. She said she'd always had trouble when other people got attention she thought should be hers. She talked about growing up with a sister who was prettier and more popular, and how their parents always seemed to favor her. She said when she married Frank and saw how easily his sons accepted me, it brought back all those old feelings of not being good enough. Catherine nodded and said that made sense, but pointed out that Linda had taken those feelings out on me instead of dealing with them herself. She asked Linda if she could see how her behavior had hurt me and damaged her relationship with her own family. Linda nodded slowly and wiped her eyes, but she still wouldn't look at me directly. Over the next few weeks, we went to therapy every Wednesday after school. Linda started acknowledging specific things she'd done to exclude me. She admitted lying about the airline tickets and giving me the wrong terminal number. She talked about the times she'd made up excuses to keep me from family activities. She said she'd been jealous of how much Frank and the boys liked me, and it made her feel like she was losing her family to me. Catherine asked her to think about why she saw it as losing instead of gaining. Linda struggled with that question and didn't have a good answer. She still didn't fully apologize or take complete responsibility for everything, but she stopped making excuses. She stopped saying I was too likable or too present. She stopped blaming me for her feelings. Tom and Bobby watched her carefully during these sessions and called her out if she tried to backtrack or minimize what she'd done. Frank stayed quiet most of the time, but his presence felt protective, like he was making sure Linda couldn't twist the narrative again. Frank started being more careful about family time after that. He made sure to include me in everything and shut down any attempts by Linda to create separate activities. When he took the boys to a basketball game, he made Linda come too and sit with all of us instead of letting her stay home. When Linda suggested the boys might want to do something just with her, Frank said we did things as a family now. He planned dinners where we all had to be present and movie nights where everyone participated. Linda looked frustrated sometimes, but she went along with it. She couldn't argue without making herself look worse. Tom and Bobby became even more protective of me after seeing everything their mom had done. If Linda said anything that sounded like she was trying to exclude me, they called her out immediately. Bobby told her once at dinner that she needed to stop being weird about having me around. Tom said if she couldn't